So, René Meulensteen, welcome to the show.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me.
Thank you. Thanks very much for taking the time. Could you just give us give us an understanding? Where did your coaching career start? Where and when, and how did that come about?
Originally, obviously, I've been born in Holland, in a smaller village. Anybody that knows Holland a little bit, I was sort of caught in the triangle between Nijmegen, Eindhoven, PSV, and Venlo. Small village. I was lucky that I grew up with a group of really good, talented players. Although scouting at the time wasn't really at the same level as it is now. So we really just played our football in our local club, but we did very well over there. And as I was sort of starting to play, I started to basically gain an interest outside just playing for coaching as well. So my coaching career started as young as 16. I was 16 and I was asked to help with one of the younger age groups at the club, I think 9 years of age, and I started to coach them. And I never stopped ever since. So I've been starting coaching from a very young age onwards.
So, and tell us about your coaching methodology. So where did you learn how to coach? What was the first sort of, sparks in coaching?
Two ways. I sort of entered one of the youth coaching courses of the Dutch FA. They came for me very, very early. So you learn the basics basically of organising, planning and running a session. But the most important thing for me was that when I was sort of strolling through a neighbouring village called Boxmeer, and I came past the bookstore, and there was this book in the window, and it said the plan for the ideal footballer, and it was written by Will Curver. Everybody probably knows about Curver coaching. So I went in and I picked up a copy, had a look at it, just went through the pages, and then went back to the front, and I read the preface, and that really struck home, because when I read the preface, I thought, you don't need to go to university to understand what this man means. And in a nutshell, basically what he was saying, he had the same he sort of missed something in his journey to become the best possible coach he could be. So he started to analyse, the better teams that were out there and the better players that were out there at the time. So you talk about players like Di Stefano, Puskas, Cruyff, Beckenbauer, and all of them age groups. And he basically realised that all those players had the ability to dominate the 1v1 situations in the game. So he then started to analyse, okay, how does that look like? Because not everybody does the same. And then he started to categorise all those 1v1 situations, which he broke down in 4 different, situations, really, whether the defender is, challenging from the side, from an angle, from behind, or in front of you. And that, I took that book with me, and that book was at that time was basically Curver explaining all the different moves by a sequence of 4 pictures. Picture 1, picture 2, picture 3, picture 4 with an explanation. And that's how I started to learn all those moves in the front garden and the back garden. I started to implement it with the young kids and the training, and I had a lot of success with it.
So, I mean, because in this country, maybe people are familiar with the Cove coaching soccer school, but tell us a bit about Will Cove. I mean, he's the guy who created this and he wrote that book. How important was he? Did you have much interaction after that with him? How important was he generally as an influence in your career?
Yeah, very, very big, because as I grew up, I went through the different courses, but obviously I really had a big interest in his career and what he was doing. So I was gathering as much information as I could. I was speaking to contacts that were in contact with him. And eventually, through a little bit at a later stage, when I was growing up, I had the opportunity to join the CIOS, which is the Central Institute of Sports. It was very hard for me to basically get a place when you were 18, 19, when you're sort of coming off high school, but eventually I mentioned to get on it. The director in that university, CIOS, was very, very helpful to me. I explained what I wanted, and basically my final project was a sort of a 20-minute video that basically explained what Curver, the message that Curver wanted to send to all those coaches out there in football. So basically what he was saying is, we need to develop more coaches that can teach young kids the skills of all those great players. That was the message. And at that time, I was a youth coach at NEC Nijmegen, and I did exactly that. I was just working, purely on skill development and skills and 1v1 and dominating. We were really developing really well. And at one point, by coincidence, I ran into one of the most influenced journalists of a magazine called Football International in Holland, who actually wrote the preface of the book of Wheel Curve. He was a big Wheel Curve fan. We sort of talked about my project. He says, "Come and when you finish it, let me have a look at it." And he then eventually got me in contact with Curve, who at that time was just getting a new job in Qatar. That was around 1993. Got a long story short, but eventually I got to meet him close to where he lives in Limburg. It was the most, interesting conversations I've ever had with a man. I've never had a man looking right through me, and asking so many, deep questions. But eventually I came out all right, because a few months later I went to join him, and I worked with him for about 4 years in Qatar.
Okay, interesting. So let's we'll come back to the Qatar work. Let's wind it back a bit. Talk about your first academy job in Holland. You mentioned that. How did that come about? What was that like in terms of your coach and working with those elite young players?
Yeah, I did have the ambition, like a lot of young players, to play at the highest level or eventually become a professional footballer. Like I said, scouting was difficult. At the time, there wasn't much going on, so you had to work your own way up, which I did. I went through, play about 3-4 levels higher than the place I come from. Eventually, I went to play at sort of the third tier of Holland at that time. The whole leagues have changed now. With in Holland, you got now the Eredivisie and the First Division, and then second and third. At that time, you just had the Eredivisie, First Division, and then you had a sort of a semi-professional amateur level, which was called the Hoofdklasse. I played there for a club called the Treffers. The coach that I had at that time was becoming the coach of NEC Nijmegen. He knew of my interest in working with with young players, what I did, technical work, and I joined him at NEC Nijmegen, coaching the 14s, and that's how it came about. So I started to play for them in the second team and coached, during the evenings.
Do you remember what a typical session might have looked like when you first started coaching those 14s? It's
like I said, it was just a carry on with, I had better players. I used those players as well to make that video for Wheel Curve eventually. So it was all skill orientated. Everything was all about making the kids as skillful as they can, creating a lot of opportunity. Coaches is all about repetition and success. So it was all skill development at one side, and then it was all creating the environment for the kids to experience and explore. 1v1, 2v2s, 3v3s, 4v4s, all the way up to 2v1, 3v2, 4v3s. The reason why I always use the overloads is that the players themselves get into an environment where they have to make the decision whether to dribble or to pass. Because I never believed in a situation where the coach was telling the players what to do, because they might do it and it might be a right decision, but it's still not their decision. It's your decision. And I wanted to bring the players, I make them technically as best as I could and bring them from awareness to understanding. So aware, what moves, what turns have you got in what particular 1v1 situation? Do you understand how to use it and what end product will come after it, which could be a pass, continue to dribble, a cross or a shot. Eventually, I took it then to a little bit the bigger games, into more structured, a bit more tactical information about width and depth and time and space. But it was all around, making sure that the players could make the right decisions. When they got under pressure, can you get out of trouble and find a better solution for yourself?
Do you remember, this might be, asking a long time ago, but do you remember how much time you would have spent on team possession and how much time you would have spent on individual possession as a sort of percentage working with under 14s?
I think if you slice it up as a sort of a pizza, and I always use this when I speak to other coaches. If you work with very young players, you have a lot of small pieces of the pizza, and I mean 6 to 8 minutes. Yeah, and then you do something else. For instance, if you work with 8 to 9 to 10-year-olds, I was working 12 to 13, 14, so the slices of the pizza were slightly bigger. They were all in between 10 to 12 minutes. So 10 to 12 minutes practice, 10 to 12 minutes play. 10 to 12 minutes practice into a more game-related situation, for instance, with finishing. Then again, 10 to 12 minutes game where that finishing or whatever they practice came back. So, and then in the end, you probably ended up with, like a bit of a longer game, but that would still be chopped up by two times 10 minutes or something like that.
It's interesting you think about Holland. I mean, I've been lucky to travel there a bit and watch a few of the academies train and play competitions there when I was in academy football. There is that culture of technical coaching, isn't it? Ball mastery and 1v1 is pretty much a staple in most academies. Yeah. Why is culturally there's such a emphasis on technique? Yeah,
I think Holland has always has got a culture and an identity of making sure that we work the ball as well as we can, on and around the pitch, try to find the extra man, utilising space and everything. I honestly do think that they cut themselves short in not really adapting and introducing the Curve method throughout their whole, coaching curriculum, because I think we would have been even further ahead than in many other countries. Holland, for instance, is a Western European country, but it's got almost a sort of South European or almost South American influence in it. Yeah, because, like I said, we always like to play. A certain style. We've produced some unbelievable, incredible, individual, skillful players, from Johan Cruyff to Marco van Basten, from Ruud Gullit, from all players that have played at very high leagues, in top teams, won Champions League, won championships. And because of that, we've always, most of the time, had a strong national team. But it's definitely part of the Dutch DNA, yeah.
So you're saying that in the Dutch Federation courses, you won't find much ball mastery and 1v1 World Cove?
They have sort of, introduced it, but under a sort of a different name. They never really sort of adopted it in the way that I think. I mean, in my opinion, we had two masters of the game, right? In terms of development, it was Will Curver, who I felt hit the nail on the head in terms of, okay, what should we be doing with the young kids onwards, all the way up to making as skillful as we can? Because at the end of the day, football is the same game, played for many years. But obviously there's a lot of things have changed over the last 30 to 40 years in terms of, the pitches and some of the rules and whatever. But certain things will always remain the same. It doesn't really matter. At the end of the day, the players that have that individual ability to dominate that 1v1 will also most likely dominate the game. Whether you go all the way back to Di Stefano, to Puskas, all the way up to Messi, Ronaldo, and Neymar, or Mbappe, it's the same thing. The other one is obviously Johan Cruyff in terms of the style he wanted to play. And I always felt I tried to see if we can bring the two together, in terms of development, that Curve ones, and then in terms of style of play, to see if I can, implement the principles that that Cruyff things are really important.
Yeah, so I was going to bring that up. I remember I've read your quote somewhere where you've got the work of Cruyff and the work of Will Cove, and you merge those through that together you have the perfect development system. And that'd be my question. Here in England, we have a similar issue with the federation. Maybe they haven't really embraced ball mastery in 1v1, even though obviously in England it's not as as renowned as in Holland. But also, we seem to have two different camps here in England. The development, people either want to play like Barcelona, or they want to basically try and ball mastery, dribble, and trying to convince people that merging somewhere in the middle, because in my experience working at Spurs, and we had very much that 1v1 and ball mastery development, it was a lot easier to teach the possession in under 11s because they were technically so good, and they could play one touch and break lines with the ball at the feet, or and passing it. So we're going to come on to your work at United in a minute, but I mean, how important would you say that for academies particularly to try and introduce both those elements in their development system?
It is obviously very, very important. And when I was the skills development coach at United, because like I said before in the program, coaching is about repetition and success. So if you want to make somebody very, very skillful, you need to give them the opportunity to have a lot of touches on the ball. So if every player has got a ball, you've got 100% repetition. As soon as you and I have to share a ball, it drops to 50%. If 4 players share a ball, it drops to 25%. So what I try to say is that in the process of making players skillful in terms of practice and repetition and practice and playing, that's the key. That's why we came up with the formats, of playing a lot of 1v1, 2v2, 3v3, 4v4s, 2v1, 3v2s, and then 4v3s. But eventually, the normal sort of game, on the Sunday, the 8v8 game situations, we changed it more to a 4v4 festival. And basically, because we wanted the kids to experience, to have a lot of touches on the ball, play a lot of different games, whether it was 2 goals, 4 goals, line ball, whatever we came up with. And they all played 6 to 8 minute games. So everybody was playing, nobody was standing on the sideline. And I can remember trying to explain the reasons behind it, because the biggest mistake that we in the past have made as adults is try to project the adult game, on the youngsters, on the seniors, which is, totally out of context. So it is a completely different environment which you have to create, where again you try to achieve 2 things: repetition and success. Give the kids create an environment where they can explore, where they can express themselves, and where they can learn by trial and error.
Especially now, we almost, in the current climate, there's a lot of pushback towards that work as well, because there's a sense that everything must be in a game. There's this a lot of research-based thing, and again, we're trying to talk about balance and they're doing things all around. But I mean, what's your thoughts on that in terms of the real sort of movement towards game-based coaching?
The game is important, but it's the same thing when this whole discussion started in Holland so many years ago. When René Meulensteen came up with his plan in Holland to say, let everybody just play 4v4s, and basically the counter argument of Will Curver was, I said, listen, that's great, I'm all for it, but if a player is not able to dominate a 1v1 in a 4v4, he will also not be able to dominate it in a 6v6, 9v9, 11v11. It doesn't matter. These kids need help. And that was the whole story. So in other words, you need to sometimes bring those kids out of an environment and show them, which is done by any other sport, where kids have good potential. And that's where the 10,000 rule comes from. What do they do in the 10,000 rule? They do things again and again and again and again. And so it becomes subconscious. I mean, it is the environment that we've created. And, when I became a skills development coach at Man United, if you look at, the players, for instance, look at Marcus Rashford, who came through that sort of environment. When he came to 16, 17, 18, sort of introducing himself on the senior scene, he didn't have to think about what move he's going to use, to solve a 1v1 situation. He's got it in him. And that's the process you need to get through. It's a balance. It's the right balance. And if it's delivered in the right way, one complements the other.
So let's talk about the job at Man United. How did that come about? Where were you? You said you were in Qatar. How did that come about? And tell us about those first experiences.
Yeah, I was in Qatar at the time. I was managing a club called Al Sadd. I started in Qatar in '93, but I knew that it was going to be difficult for me in Holland to eventually break through and do the pro license. So I thought I'd find an alternative route. So I went through all the coaching courses in England. So I went in '93, I went back in '95, back in '97. And in those courses, I met obviously quite a few people. One of them was Dave Richardson, who was, when Howard Wilkinson, came up with a plan to put all those academies into place. Dave Richardson was one of them, with a few other people that were sort of safeguarding that all the academies did have, the right criteria. So at one point, I met up with Dave. I think it was in Kiel University. They held a tournament. We had a little bit of a training camp with the Qatari national under 16 team. We were invited to play as a host, as a guest country for the Nordic Cup with England and Norway and Finland and Denmark. And he came to watch my session, and he saw it was different. Again, it was 16-year-olds, but still there was this element of getting into 1v1s, overloads and all sorts. And we started talking, and he basically was the one that said, listen, we need something like this in England. We've got the academies now, but we haven't got the right program, especially on a grassroots level. So I always stayed in touch with Dave Richardson, and he's tried to open quite a few doors, to be fairly honest, but never really one materialized. Until one day I was coming to England anyway because there was a. Sorry, are you still there?
Yeah, I'm still there, mate. It's okay. It's all right, René. Got it.
Okay, because I don't know why that happened to me. Sorry. There was this course around Nottingham, I think, and I spoke to Dave that I was coming over. I stayed at that time with Dave Mackay, the legendary playing of Tottenham, and Dave and I were neighbours in Qatar because he had the national under-17 team, so I stayed with him. But again, cut a long story short, just before I flew out, Dave Richardson rang me and said, Les Kershaw, academy manager of Man United, has been in touch. He would like to meet you when you're over, because they are looking, for a technical coach. And that's when in that period, that's when I met Les together with Jeff Watson, one of the scouts. It was a really good conversation. There was anything about, how this was going to take along. I just give him some material to look at, some videos that I did around that dominating 1v1, and went back home. Went back to Qatar to be the manager of Al Sadd at that time. Obviously, I spoke to Dave Mackay that I've met somebody at Manchester United, and apparently he did ring Sir Alex Ferguson, to ask him and say, listen, I believe you are looking at a technical coach, which I happen to know. I work with him in Qatar. I can recommend him. So that all sped up the whole process basically, and I think it was in October afterwards, like a month afterwards, when Dave Mackay rang me and said, has Sir Alex Ferguson rang you? And I started laughing because Dave was always somebody that he would always crack a joke before he came. And I said, no, I've just hung up on Prince Charles. No, he said, no. He says, honestly, I'm telling you, he says, I've been just talking to Sir Alex Ferguson. He was going to give you a ring. He says, well, maybe you've given the wrong number, Dave, because since you've left Qatar, they've added another number, through the local number. I said, that might be it. Anyway, a few minutes later, 10 minutes later, Sir Alex Ferguson rang, and he said that he spoke to Dave Mackay, and we had about a 20-minute conversation over the phone. And we decided to meet up when I had a break in January, and that's when I came over, met everybody at Manchester United, spoke to Sir Alex Ferguson, did a few sessions with the different age groups, and that's when they decided to bring me in the summer of 2001.
So what was your job description when you first went in there? What was your duties? What age groups were you working in?
It was obviously mainly focusing on the grassroots level first and foremost. They had all the development centres in place, kids 6, 7 years of age. They had the two other teams, under 8s, under 9s within the academy. Les Kershaw came up with the right title, skills development coach. I quite like that. But in a broad way, it wasn't that I was working with one particular team. I was basically trying to oversee and work very closely with Mike Glennie, who organised all the logistics of the development centres and all those, and all the coaches. So I had to educate the coaches to buy in the skill development program. I had to educate the parents, and it all went really, really well. And obviously, the better the coaches got, the product got better at all the development centres. We wanted to work in the same way as we did at the Cliff. At the Cliff, and eventually we established 4 advanced centres, which made it easier for us to create a better flow for the better kids to come in and have a look at them, to eventually make a better decision which one we would let into the Manchester United Academy when we were under 9.
And so tell us about how that progressed then, that role. When did you start working with the older groups in the academy?
It went bit by bit, really, because eventually it's important that you make everybody understand that it's like when a kid, when young kids go to school and eventually they learn things through playing, and then they learn what a letter is, and then they learn what a word is, and then they learn what a sentence is, and then they learn how to read. So eventually it's like, same with football, you break things down, you create an environment again where playing and fun and, learn through playing and everything. that's happening, but it's important that also the coaches can see how does it look like when they get to 16, 17, 18. So basically, it's a process that goes from technique into skill into strategy. That's basically the line that I've always followed. And through the process, the coaches have different aspects that they need to. I always looking at coaches that at a younger age they can teach the technique. When they get a bit older, when they get 10, 12, 13, I want coaches that can challenge and implement that technique in small-sided games. So you're back to the 1v1s all the way up to the 4v4s. And afterwards, that next implementation goes into the bigger games, 6v6, 7v7. Around 12 to 13 years of age, you would say that the identity of the player comes out. You know what player you're looking at. Is it a defender, midfielder, forward? Does he play in the right, middle, or on the left-hand side? So you get more information about the player. So it becomes more of a development from a base, a wide base, into specific. And then eventually you get into, let's say 13, 14, 15, where the introduction comes into 11v11. And then it's all about learning how to play the bigger game, bigger distances. How does that 1v1 apply to your specific position on the pitch?
Okay. And so tell us a little bit about then, so you've gone into May night. Obviously, no one's doing this sort of work in academy football. It's a very un-English way to do things, if you like. How did the coaches respond, and how easy was it to get them to, one, get the buy-in, and two, to upskill these guys to try and implement your philosophy?
Well, there wasn't really a big issue in the coaches not buying into it. And the biggest thank to that and the influence goes to Sir Alex Ferguson. Because I invited him a few times to Littleton Road in the early stages of what we were trying to do. I showed him the environment. We brought also quite a few first team players to join in at times with those younger players. And he and I had some conversations about it, why we were doing it and where this needed to go to. And I said, it's very important that there's a follow-on from it. To move it on, next stage, like I said, from technique into strategy, technique into skill into strategy. That was the biggest influence, because he basically made all the coaches see that this was, oops, are we off again?
Yeah, I think we lost you a bit. Why don't you see if you can get, because the reception cut off a little bit. You carry on and maybe we'll come back in. We can try and get it back on if you just try.
Right, okay. But you can hear me okay?
Yeah, I can hear you, yeah.
Okay, great. So yeah, that was a big influence. So therefore, it was easy for me. The coaches were buying into it. The coaches that I worked with at that time, they were brilliant. They were very receptive, very good, skill-wise. So they enjoyed it a lot. They could see the progress that the players were making. So all in all, that was a very, very good process. The biggest sort of problems or the challenges that we had to overcome was convincing other clubs to join in with us in the 4v4 festival than rather playing 8v8. And that's, where you meet a lot of coaches with having those traditional views, which for us was the biggest challenge really, because what we wanted was just creating the right environment for training, but also the right environment for games, where again, repetition and success were the key elements.
And what was your first impression of young English players compared to what you'd seen in Holland and maybe what you've seen in other parts of the world?
So I've learned one thing from Cove when I was in Qatar, and I can still remember one of the first days we worked in the Doha Stadium, an old little Doha Stadium with about 60, 70 kids running on the pitch. 8, 9 years of age. There wasn't anything then organised at that day, so they're all running around. And Will Curry used to say to me, listen, youth all over the world is pure gold. It's pure gold. They just respond to the environment you create. So whilst we were working at it, we saw the progress these little kids in Qatar, the small country of Qatar, were making. We had a lot of discussions, and I said to Will many times, can you imagine if you go to like a country like England, who have an unbelievable competitive mentality and an attitude anyway. If you can make them, so skillful as we try to do, they're going to be unstoppable. And that was basically also what I've experienced when I came to United and when we were working, in those development centres. We're working at the Cliff, we're working at Littleton Road. It was just sheer enthusiasm of those kids coming in, playing, and showing off their skills. It was fantastic, and there was a big research report being done by that time by Manchester University, by Rick Finoglio, and I think the report has been eventually been published through the FA and everything. I still think people can find it, but it was so evident that all the outcomes were so much more positive for 4v4 in comparison to 8v8. And we knew we were on the right track, but also we knew we were on the right track because we could see the kids enjoy playing the football, we could see them progressing, we could see them getting better and more skillful.
Interesting. Yeah, I know, familiar with the 4v4 project. Very interesting findings. But that's interesting, isn't it? Because you're doing such great work that you're getting all these results, but maybe that didn't filter down into many other clubs and other because I remember the pushback, hearing other coaches in the north talking about, the United 4v4 way and stuff like that, because it's very untypical English things to do. So it's about, I suppose, trying to change that culture, right?
Well, that's it. It all starts with culture. Every successful business, organization, club, country goes with culture. That's where the roots lay of being successful or not successful.
Tell us a bit about then. Go on, sorry, go on, René.
No, and basically that, it's the hardest thing to change. Obviously, culture, because people are set in their ways. Unless they are open-minded and they have, the outlook to say, okay, let's give it a go over time, because it's not something that you will see, in 1 or 2 weeks' time. You have to really give it a go for a season or more. But then the evidence is there for everybody to see. And eventually, if you look back to the players that have come through the academy during that time, who's made it, in United's first team, or even have great careers in other clubs in the Premier League or elsewhere, they've all benefited from it.
Okay, just before you just move on to you moving up to the first team, could you just talk a little bit about the ball mastery work, particularly the unopposed work? So we talked a lot about the 1v1, 2v2, 3v3s, and your overloads, and just talk us about the ball mastery and tell us about the methodology behind that in terms of linking it to the 1v1 and the importance and the benefits of it working alone with the ball.
Yeah, well, the ball is the ball can be your biggest friend and should be your biggest ally. It can be your biggest enemy if you don't control it, if it doesn't do what you want. So there's no way of coming away from it to master it, to making sure that in any different ways. To do exercises is to control it, left and right. And if you do that with ball mastery and you send those motorial skills, automatically, then both feet will do improve. Now, I've heard a lot of discussions, especially when England failed to qualify for a European Championship, or they qualified for a World Cup, or they got knocked out. The whole discussion started all up about skill development and tactical. Loads of people talk about it. But nobody really talks about it, that it's an aspect which you have to break down. And it starts with ball manipulation exercises. Yeah, so with very young kids, that they roll the ball on different parts of the foot. The sole of the foot, they roll it forwards, they roll it backwards, they roll it sideways, left and right, both feet. And it's difficult to explain by just explaining, but talking about it, how to do it. But it's all ball feeling exercises. Those ball feeding exercises then go into what I call fast feet. And the fast feet exercises, they're all basically starting with the little tippy tappies. That's where it all starts. And from those tippy tappies, we developed, about 10 to 12 core exercises, where the kids are constantly having touches on the ball. The tippy tappies are basically nothing else than almost the glue between a different move. So if a kid, would go tippy tappies straight, the next one would be tippy tappies with, semicircles. The next one would be tippy tappies with rolling the ball across, with the sole of your foot. The other one would be tippy tappies and a stop turn. And so we would carry on. But everybody every move would have a number, all the way up 1 to 10. Then the next step was for the kids to combine numbers, like number 4 and number 7, number 2 and number 8, number 5 and number 9. And then eventually you go to numbers like 4, 7, and 9. So they get more and more, and eventually it's nothing else, and kids could go for 30 seconds or 45 seconds and move all those moves together. That's the fast feet move, because a lot of the functional skills are built into, the fast feet exercises. So ball manipulation, ball feeling, fast feet, and then you go into the particular basic skills. Break them down, and you say, okay, those are the moves that you use to turn directions up and down. This is one move. We had about 5 or 6. Stop turn, Cruyff turn, step over. I think everybody that has done a little bit of technical development will know what I'm talking about. Then you would have moves where people come from an angle, where it's the inside hook twist turn, the outside hook twist turn, flick behind, the little Maradona or the Zidane, whatever you call them. So all them sort of moves. Then you have the moves where there's defenders front on, scissors, double scissors, sidestep, double sidestep, other moves, again, step overs. And then when there's a defender behind, which is the most complicated one and also very specific. So in that order, that's also how I would teach them. Ball manipulation, fast feet, basic moves, then feinting moves, and then you would go into the more advanced skills, which, where the defender comes from a particular situation. But the key is to make sure you break it down, you go through the process of repetition where the kids experience those moves, they can do it in isolation, and then you constantly bring them in a game scenario where they can try it.
I think that's where a lot of people maybe have the misunderstanding about this type of work, because it's all functional work, right? It's all linked to the game. It's all moves taken directly from the game, and then try and link it to your small-sided games, right? It
is for younger kids. It's nothing else than, like I said, the key is to, let's say you're working up and down moves, and you do the stop turn and a step over, right? Not too much at a time, because you need to come, repeat, add something, and so on. But again, it's the pizza slice, small pizza slice. Practice, play. But in the playing scenario, you need to create a game where the game wants them to make the moves. So you cannot be one directional then, because they won't make the move. So you need to sort of create some sort of environment where the kids are constantly challenged by changing that direction up and down. And that you can do that with line ball, you can do that with 4 goals, you can do that with different scenarios.
I was speaking to a scout at another club who was at United when you were there, and he was talking about your session delivery and how you used to just progress from one activity to the other without moving many cones, things sort of going seamlessly to try and keep the tempo, I assume. There, tell us a bit about that. How important is that for delivery of sessions and keeping children active?
Well, it's all about, you have to understand a little bit how kids learn and the level of concentration and focus that young kids have. Now, there's only 2 ways or 3 ways really in coaching that you can use. Very, very structured. So you tell the kids exactly what they're doing and where they're going and what suited they're moving. Or you go a little bit more in between. So you tell them certain things, but the kids can then apply their own moves and skills. Or you go all the way to the end where you create an environment where it's very freely flowing. Those are the 3 scenarios. There's not one better than the other. You as a coach need to pick one what works best. So if you work with kids that never done any skill development before, you better work in a little bit more structured way. Whether you work in 2s and 3s or 4s, whether you work in a square, in a diamond, in a triangle, or a zigzag formation. It doesn't really matter what you choose. But you have control of what the kids are doing, what direction they're traveling, and what distance they're traveling. Remember, coaching is all about repetition and success. If the kids have never done any skill development and you go straight away to the very free-flowing environment, then it becomes a bit of a mess. And nobody really does, in the right way what you want them to do. So it's a normal process of taking them through from that structured scenario to that semi-structured scenario into that free-flowing scenario. It's all the way of bringing the kids from, that conscious sort of coaching scenario to the subconscious, where they can use it in the games, the small-sided games, and experiment with it.
Okay, excellent. So tell us a little bit about then your move up to the first team. How did that come about?
Again, it was a bit of a coincidence, really, because I got to, obviously, through my time in Carrington, I got to know quite a few first team players, and the one really that wanted to do a little bit of extra work was Jago Forlan initially. And Jago was that sort of player. Sometimes they just get to the club, at the wrong time almost. Because obviously you had Ruud van Nistelrooy, who was, banging in, 1, 2, 3 goals every weekend. Diego could also play different positions, and you had obviously fantastic players in each of those positions. But he wanted to do some extra work. He felt he wanted to do some extra skill work. And what I identified with Diego was that Diego had basically all the attributes. Because the reasons why you want to have those moves and skills at the highest level is to become more effective, but in forward and attacking play, become more unpredictable. Now, Jago was quick, he was explosive, and more than anything, he had 2 good feet. He was as good with his right as with his left, but he didn't have any moves to manipulate the ball from his left to his right, or vice versa. And that is where I started to work with him, that when he was sort of facing forward, coming to the goal at an angle or coming straight out, what can you do? What moves can you use to get yourself in better shooting positions? So that developed, and that was, Jago loved it. We did it 3-4 times a week, and eventually, obviously, more players, started to hear about it, and then eventually, a bit more players came. Ruud van Nistelrooy joined in as a striker, also with them. Ole Gunnar Solskjaer joined in later. So eventually I got more and more work. And the biggest, I think, the step for that was when a lot of players got injured and the physios were done with their work, a lot of times they weren't ready to go back to the group, but they needed football training. And that was the ideal gap that I could fill. So I worked a lot with players that just came back from injury. They were nearly ready to go. So I had about 3, 4, 5 to 6 sessions before they went back to the group training. And what I then would always do was I would always highlight their specific position, whether it was a defender, midfielder, forward, and I would then say, let's have a look what we can add to your game. I would never talk about change. I would always talk about add. Add means more. Change means what players will go, what am I doing wrong? So with the midfield players like Darren Fletcher and those sort of players, I worked a lot on changing the angles of the attack, so to create a completely different picture, on the pitch. Forwards, it was all about, taking players on, but also realizing that sometimes one move is not enough to beat an opponent. So what can you do? What can you do then? And that's how it evolved, So over that time, over that period, I had a chance to have an opportunity to work a lot with players in 1v1 situations.
And so Van Nistelrooy, for example, he, one of the best finishes, this league's ever seen. What did you tell to him? How do you add to a player like that game? Because obviously a lot of his stuff is finishes one touch in the box. So you're talking about his 1v1 work. How did you add to his?
Yeah, it was two things. It's all about, first of all, it's about getting the players, taking the players through a little bit of a journey through awareness and understanding. So if I would have asked the question to Ruud, and I did the same thing, where do you score your goals? Is he aware? How many he scores and how many he scores within the box, within, let's say, the actual box? Is he aware of what sort of finishes they are? 1-touch finishes, 2-touch finishes, and then secondly or thirdly, what are the chances that he doesn't take, and especially when they come outside the box. And what does he understand? Does he understand what we need to add to also make that part of his game? And basically, what all those teams do at the top level, they analyze, all the opposition. They analyze all the opposition strikers, and that was exactly the same with Ruud. And Ruud was a player that was his timing of the runs were very good. He would get there just a fraction earlier for the player, so he was very good at one-touch finishes. The key was that there were moments where that didn't happen, so the ball got blocked. And I said to Ruud that if you get into positions where you just in the corner of your eye see that probably that defender is going to get in front of you, that's where that element of disguise comes in, to pretend to shoot and maybe do a little Cruyff turn or a little chop to making sure you're creating a better opportunity for yourself. That was one element. So in the box, when you could see defenders coming out to block, and when players block, they have to go for it. So if they go, you sell them. They're gone. That was one element. The other element was when he had space in behind the back line. So when he could really run and drive with the ball. And I don't know whether you remember the goal he scored against Fulham, I think he was, when he picked the ball up around the halfway line. He picked the ball up and then he ran all the way in the box, and eventually he put it in the back of the net. Now in that week, I showed him an element that I said, if I start running with the ball like you, and I'm 20 years younger than you, or older than you, I can still show you that you cannot stop me. Just because I'm running directly at you, and the moment you're just off balance, I go left and right. You might catch me up later, but you cannot stop me whilst I'm running with you. So the element of driving with the ball, really close control, driving really, really fast, and making sure that the player, you get to the player running straight at him, and then change direction. That was another element that we worked on in terms of, because he tended to, receive the ball at times and link it off and going wide and then join into game, whereas he could open up on the back foot and just run with it. Which is, at times.
Yeah, so he's like typical number 9, wants to set it and spin and that sort of thing.
Yeah,
So I'm just interested, René. So for instance, you're introducing him. So you talk about the first stage, the disguise, the Cruyff for the cut. So tell us about how do you develop that in him? What's the learning process like a pro player? How do you develop that particular skill in him in terms of on the pitch?
Well, what I did with the forwards at United, I sort of always made them a bit more aware of what sort of areas you basically have got in front of a goal, of a football goal. So basically, I would have I don't know if I've got a pen here, but anyway. But basically, what I did, if you have a goal, I would draw a line from the 2 posts all the way to the end of the 16 yards. So you would have a zone between the post right in front of the goal. I always used to say to the players, listen, if you're in zone 1, this is your best opportunity to score the goal, because the goalkeeper will most likely be in the middle of the goal, so you can shoot bottom right, middle right, top right, bottom left, middle left and top left. That's the biggest and the most important of difficult for the goalkeeper. Then I drew a line from the post all the way to the corner of the box to the left and one to the other side. So you got 2 sort of, almost triangle areas. So if you move out to that zone, you come into zone 2 on the left-hand side, or you come in zone 2 on the right-hand side. So if you approach the goal in zone 2, the goal never moves, but the goalkeeper does. So the goalkeeper will slightly adjust his angle towards the ball. The player then has to adjust his situation, how to going to finish, because there's better angles, far in the corner, bend it in, top corner, bottom corner, and the same thing on the left. If you then have an opponent in front of you in zone 2, it's better to beat them on the inside to go to zone 1, because it increases your chances to score. If you would beat them on the outside, which is the other triangle, which is zone 3, you come very close to the byline. So you get a very sharp angle, most likely very difficult to finish, but better to cross or for a cutback. So that was sort of the awareness that I had with all those forwards, how they would approach those zones when they would come to the goal. And what I would then do when I would work with them, I would paint a particular scenario and I would just feed balls into them because balls come into different angles. Always a repetition of 4. So I would go 1, 2, 3, 4. They do the same thing. Open up, bend it in. Open up, bend it in. Why repetitions of 4? Because of my experience, that's when the quality and the concentration stays the highest. The moment you go over 5 and 6, the quality drops and it doesn't become game realistic. You need to keep him on the toes because at the end of the day the ball need to get in the back of the net. And then I created all different scenarios. I worked from zone 1 to zone 2. I worked with balls from the side. I worked from balls into the midfield, from the midfield that I played in. I just created every time a very game realistic situation. On top of that, I always, with every player, I used to try to find video clips that would happen in the game or it had happened in the game with them. So I could then take him to the video room and say, listen, this is what I mean. This is the scenario where you are. This is what you did. Now we've given you an extra tool because most likely when this is happening, this is what the defender is going to do. This is what you can do. If that then happened in the games afterwards, I would all save that. And again, at certain times when I thought it is right, I brought the players back in and say, come and have a look at this. And that's the whole process, basically. You know, awareness and understanding, working it on the pitch, let them experience it. Then they have success in the game. Bang.
So, and just a little bit of that, then you work with Ronaldo, obviously one of the now world-class player. Very much, it's interesting because almost very much technically really excellent, but maybe need a little bit more of the game strategy to maybe finish it off.
Well, that was, with Ronaldo, I got the fortunate, because he's never injured. I was just fortunate that he was suspended for, I think, the first three or four league games in one particular season. I can't remember which one. I think the one leading 2007, 2008. Obviously, he had a few good seasons already. He became more and more important. But it was all about making him even more effective in front of goal. And the conversation started basically asking Cristiano, says, listen, of the first session that we had on a Saturday morning when the team was playing, he said, have you set your new goals, your targets for this season? He said, what do you mean? He says, well, how many goals have you scored last season? He says, 23. He says, well, I assume you want to get better, you want to progress. So if you want to progress, you would probably wanted to score more goals. Have you thought about that? And I said, do you know how important target setting and aims are for successful people? It's very, very powerful. And so he said, he said 30. Okay, he says from 23 to 30, it's better. And he says, what do you think? He says, well, I think you should go for 40. He says, well, that's nearly double. He says, yes, I know, but the reason why I say 40, because I looked at all your goals. I looked at also the chances that you could have scored goals, but you never really practiced in a way that real goal scorers do. So what do you mean by that? He said, well, I'll show you after this session. I've got a little video clip to show you. And the video clip was all about, the previous top strikers that United has had in Cole, in York, in Sheringham, and Solskjaer, Van Nistelrooy. And I just showed them, like, randomly, I don't know, maybe 60 goals. Bang, 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 one after the other. I said, what do you see? He said, what do you mean? He said, what do you see? I said, yeah, a lot of goals. I said, no, that's not what I mean. You're going to look at it again. I asked you the same question. What did you see? I didn't want to tell him. I wanted him to discover it. He says, what do you see? Then he said, yeah, I'll see a lot of different goals, a lot of variety of goals. I've seen shots, I've seen headers, I've seen volleys, I've seen chips. I've said, great, fantastic. He says, what else have you seen? He says, I've seen a lot of one-touch finishes. He says, correct, fantastically, yeah. And I see a lot of different goals in different areas in front of the goals. I said, right, there you are. I said, that's the whole three things that we're going to work on every time that we've got a chance to work on. So then I explained him about the different zones, as I just did. Zone 1, Zone 2, left and right, and Zone 3. And in a sequence of sessions, I just took him through all the different finishes that were available to him. And I always said, listen, you always need to remember this, that every goal you're going to score in a game, you have already scored on the training pitch. Every goal you score, you need to register on your hard disk. Because the moment that chance will come in the game, you just have to draw it from your hard disk, and you know how that finish is going to look like, and you're going to be more calm on the pressure. The other thing that he needed to understand was that Cristiano had the sort of, he always wanted to score the perfect goal, the most beautiful goal, the one that ends up in top corner. And that's why he used to miss quite a few opportunities. He needed to get an appreciation of just scoring the simple goal as well, and scoring goals, with different techniques, whether it was a little tap in with the inside of the foot, headers, all sorts. I say you will always score spectacular goals because of the amount you're going to score. But the most important thing is the amount of goals you're going to score. Every goal you're going to score, it's another piece of confidence, that you put in your backpack. And that was basically the journey of getting him to where he is.
Wow. So tell us a bit now, so when you become the first team coach, assistant manager, as it were, how did that really then sort of curtail a lot of the individual work you were doing with players or the ability? Was it then much more team centric, if you like, because that was just the nature of the role? Did you still get opportunities to work individually with players?
Well, the advantage of me when I sort of eventually moved up as first team coach, when Mick Phelan became assistant manager, so I've already did quite a bit of work with the players, sort of as part of. Carlos gave me the opportunity to do parts of the warm-up, certain finishing exercises. I started to work with more players, so players knew me and they knew where I was coming from. So basically the good thing for me is just reinforcing the message of having all those players now using all those techniques in all the different, in all the different condition games or possession games or games that we were doing. So it made it a little bit easier, to be fairly honest.
I mean, I suppose that's the question, is that how much time do skills coaches get when in that team environment? So you talked about before, when players are coming back from an injury, they're a lot freer. But is it just because the league season is so hectic and it's so jam packed with games and recovery training and maintenance that there's just not the time physically to work individually with players like that?
I think the key is that a lot of times it's been used a little bit as an excuse that there's not enough time for training or probably practice. The thing is that the time that you do have, you need to spend it in the best possible way. So obviously with us at Man United at the time, Sir Alex Ferguson was always big in utilising the whole squad. So there was always players ready to train. If we had smaller groups, we would bring up some of the most talented players from the under 23s. So we had always good groups to work with, and there was always room and space for some extra individual work. Why it was, just after training, we did a lot of extra finishing, at the end of training sessions. So, and if we felt that somebody needed, really some more, then obviously that was a great opportunity again. That we found ways to do that, in the sort of regular training session.
So, Ren, I think we lost you again. See if you can turn your camera on. Just don't know if it'll slip. Maybe it just slipped off.
Yeah, it just
maybe reception. No, probably it's reception. Just I don't. Obviously, I know you're a very busy man, so I'm going to keep you. Just tell us a little bit about. I'm just interested. So your transition to first team manager. How did that change your outlook on the game, or in terms of working with players? I mean, did you become a lot less? You're maybe you're an individual coach So did you become seeing the game a lot less as an individual, what they're doing, and those key 1v1 moments was much more than team possession based? And then you're thinking, did you have two different hats on, or did you manage to see the games in those two different parallel sort of ways?
Yeah, it was obviously my first one was obviously the Fulham job, and it just basically was a very strange way that how it obviously came about, because I obviously joined Fulham to help Martin Jol, to assist him, which was great. I've always liked Martin the way he is, and his thinking about football as a philosophy and everything. We're obviously in a difficult situation, but I never expected me to be in his position after only 2 league games, and it wasn't really well communicated, to be fairly honest, at that particular time. So you end up getting into a very difficult situation. At that moment in time, I looked at it and I felt that Fulham was not really trying to express themselves in the way they should, in playing in an exciting way, play more on the front foot. But as you know, obviously I came from a club that was always able to, in 90-95% of the situations, to dominate the game, to put their own, sort of strategy upon the opponents. And now I've had a complete different scenario. And I was trying to lift the spirits in one end, try to change the playing style a little bit. And like you said, it is completely different, because now suddenly you have to manage the whole squad, but from many different aspects, especially just when there's a transfer window around the corner. There's lots of things you're gonna look at. If you say to me, looking back in hindsight, so would you have done something different? I said, yeah, I hold my hand up, I would. And probably the aspect I would have changed a little bit more. I would have started exactly the same as I did, but I would have probably after that, in the games after that, because in the, I think 12, 13 games in the Premier League that I was involved, we played about, I think 9 of them in the top 10. So we knew they were always difficult. And I would have probably shored it up a little bit more, to making sure that we didn't concede as many goals as we did. And the statistics, I think at that time we lost quite a few goals just before half time or just before the end of the game, which showed that, we were lacking a little bit of energy, at that time. So I would have probably adjusted that a little bit better. But I still felt that, given the time and the players that we brought in, we were just sort of ready to sort of turn the corner when they made the decision not to continue with me. But it was an unbelievable experience, but totally different from what I was used to.
I suppose that's my question really, is that it's difficult. I mean, now, do you see a player, for instance, a fullback who doesn't utilise the 1v1 or recognise the 1v1, but, there's so many other things to worry about. You don't have time to go and try and individually work with that fullback, for example.
So when you're a manager, as soon as you go in and manage, no matter where you are, and I've worked in various countries, it's everywhere the same. It's result orientated. There's not many people who are sort of responsible for the policies and the strategies of the club that can understand the process that needs to be taking place before you can match results and a style of play. And from my experience, there's no coming away from it. It's give and take. Any manager about 18 months. Now we both know that I think 80% of more of the coaches are not being given 18 months. But if you look, for instance, to what Jurgen Klopp has established with Liverpool, and you go back to the start when he joined Liverpool, it took him about 18 months before he got Liverpool where he wanted them to be, in that dynamic, energetic pressing style. Same with Pep Guardiola with Manchester City. It took him about 18 months before the players understood that the way that he wanted to play, the possession-based game, all over the pitch, that everybody understood their roles and responsibilities. It took him about 18 months before he started to get and see the success from it. That's how it is. There's no way from it. But when you are in that results business, panic kicks in very, very quickly in the hierarchy when you lose, 2 games, 3 games, and then a lot of emotional decisions are going to be made. And most of the time it's the managers that pay the price for it.
Excellent. So let's move on then to working at international level, because you're working with us in Australia. Tell us a little bit about that, how that came about.
The assistant, my current role as assistant manager. I have to go back about probably 12 years. I think I was obviously still at Manchester United, and the current Australian national team manager Graham Arnold. He came for his pro license to visit Manchester United. He was by himself. I knew Graham as a player when he played in Holland for NAC Breda and Roda Kerkrade. So I knew him as a player. I didn't know him personally, but obviously obviously Sir Alex Ferguson would always ask me to look after those sort of people if they come in and talk through the routines of the day and development and everything. So that's how I got to know Graham. He was very appreciative of that. So we sort of spent about a week. I think he came back a second time as well. And we've basically stayed in touch ever since. He got back coaching in Australia. Was for a short spell in Japan. Went back to then Australia. Did really, really well. Won the A-League with various clubs. But he would always got in touch with me about players, especially from Holland. If I knew players that I could send him or help him. But I knew that he was thinking along the same lines in terms of how he wanted to play. And it was just about my adventure in India about a month later when he rang and he said, leading up to the World Cup in 2018, listen, René, I've been offered the national team job in Australia after the World Cup. I would like you to do it with me. What do you think? And I've always had an ambition, Saul, to get involved at the national team level somewhere, somehow. It wouldn't have necessarily to be with the national team as such, because I could also see myself work with, the national under 23 or under 21 team, because I do feel that I would be the right person to work with a lot of young and upcoming talented players, because I know what's required at the highest level. There was one conversation I've had with Danny Blind at one point with the Dutch national team. That didn't materialise at that time. But this time with Graham, I felt good about it. I thought it was great. I still like travelling. I also feel that with Australia we can have some good opportunities to qualify. Also for the World Cup, but we did already qualify for the Olympics, which unfortunately has been postponed. But that's something to look forward to. So, yeah, it's all going very well.
So just tell us a little bit about this finding, René, before I let go. Just so then, what's the different dynamic in terms of working with players that you're only seeing every couple of months, or you've only got for a few days? So winding it back to your history as a skills coach, individual coach, you've got a few days to work with players. Are you still trying to get into them individually and work on those 1v1 areas? Is it much more, game-based sort of possession thing or combination? Tell us a bit about that dynamic.
No, it's good. First of all, I have to say is that the difference between working with the national team is that within the club you've got all personal interests, and a lot have been fueled obviously by agents in the background. With the national team, we are responsible by selecting the best possible players available. And all those players, first of all and first and foremost, want to represent their country. There's a pride element. They want to make themselves pride, their families, and the country's pride. So it's a fantastic environment to work for those players. And you're right that time is limited. So what we've done, Graham and I, that the first camp that we've had, we didn't have any games. We had an opportunity, to get them together for 2 weeks in Turkey, and we had a 2-week training camp where we basically outlined, the principles of how we would like to see the Australian team play, different from what they were used to. We wanted to get them to play more on the front foot than the back foot in terms of pressing high up the park. We want them to be able to play out from the back, using various rotations, and that's where we laid the foundation. Every after camp that we've had after that, where we had games, and obviously game preparation takes precedence, But there's still moments for me working very, very, in short little bursts with players on an individual basis. And the key is for me to make sure I've got a good insight about those players by looking at video material, which is easily done by InstatScout or Y-Scout. So I've got a good way. And then we just pick particular moments where I can still utilize my expertise to work, but at the same time, I also do, group sessions as well, mainly to get the players ready for the upcoming performance.
Okay, and then just finally, what advice would you give for a young aspiring coach who'd like to carve a career in the game and work at all levels like yourself?
Well, I've always felt very strongly that I needed to have a philosophy, a vision that I strongly believed in myself. A lot of times, I wouldn't say young coaches get indoctrinated by the FA, but you would go to every FA, then whether you go to the KNVB in Holland or to Germany or to Denmark or to England, whatever, there will be differences in sort of approach. I think at the end of the day, the reasons why I found myself very confident in what I believe in is that look at the best teams out there, look how they play, look how they defend, what are their strategies, try to identify that and reasons behind that. If you know that, then you've got, I think, a good outlook. And there's different ones, because if you compare, Simeone from Atletico, compare with Klopp, or you compare with Pep Guardiola, it's completely different, but still both very successful. Wherever the truth is, that's for people to decide themselves. The other thing for me is that analyze, and especially now with the technology available and online and internet and everything, you've got access to everything. Look at the best players out there, past and present. What are the best defenders? What were their attributes? What are the best attributes of midfielders? What are the attributes of wingers and forwards? If you know that, you then know you know what to develop. The key is to break that down into development program to understand what do I need to develop first. Now, I broke it down where I felt the skill development element was the most important part at the early stages, from 5, 6 all the way up to 9, then get them into the small-sided game scenario. Again, technique into skill, teaching into challenging and implementing, and eventually you bring it into strategy. But learn as much, listen, read a lot about, top coaches in the game, try to bring all that information in, but filter it and make sure that you can, that you make it work for you. The other thing is, I think, practically is the experience about walk before you can run. It's important, first of all, to experience this. I've been a coach that has basically worked at every level that is out there in the world. Whether you talk about the youngest kids from 6, 7, and 8 years of age, all the way to 17, 18-year-olds. I've worked with amateur, senior players. I've worked with the top pros, at Manchester United, and I work with national team elite players. The key is to making sure that you find, the first thing is to go into a coaching scenario where you feel comfortable. Comfortable with the age you're working with, comfortable with the level you're working with, and you need to understand where your expertise lies. If you are very good at working with 6, 7, 8, 9-year-olds, don't try to become a coach to work with 16, 17, 18-year-olds. And that is a lot of things that club needs to understand, that the value of a good coach is not of the age group he's working with. Because in my opinion, the coach that works with 6, 7, 8-year-olds should get paid equally as much as the one that works with 18-year-olds. Because if the ones that don't do the job right in the early stages, the ones at 17, 18, 19 will never benefit from it. And that is a philosophy and a sort of a strategy that I think is more importantly for clubs to adopt, but it's important for us coaches, because a lot of coaches, therefore, they try to move up the ladder, to go from 9-year-olds to 12 and all the way up. Whereas maybe their expertise is working with a specific age group. And that is something, it's a journey that you need to know. And when you know that, become an expert at it. Become as best as you can get. And that will make you stand out from the crowd.
And what about advice to a player/parent, a young talented footballer who wants to make it all the way, or a parent of a footballer?
Well, the most important thing, the worst thing that ever can happen is when a parent lives their own dreams through their kids. The only word that you can find is support. That they need to provide for the kid. We are responsible as coaches to make sure there is the right resources and we create the right environment for the kid to enjoy. First of all, to enjoy the game, to have fun in the game, to learn, play in the game. That is our responsibility. The parents are there to support that as well, and they need to understand that role. It's important, the way that they approach that. If young kids are talented, if they've got potential, it's all a matter of for them to be picked up. Hopefully, by getting into an environment where they can play with kids as good as them, and they will naturally improve and get better as well. But it's important that the parents understand their role.
Okay, this is really the final one, I promise. So just to finish off, because obviously Meulensteen Method is working with Global Women's Sports now in America. Tell us a little bit about that in terms of what how you're supporting clubs and spreading your message across the United States.
Yeah, Meulensteen Method has existed for quite a number of years now. This is obviously my good friend and colleague, and everyone else who has been the main driving force in America from Michigan. He's established a lot of partnership clubs that sort of run their development program around the Meulensteen Method, exactly as I've tried to explain it before. We wanted to get a little bit more traction throughout America. So, to be fairly honest, GIS has been very supportive in quite a few number of events, like the USTC, the United States Technical Championships that we hold every year. They've been very much involved with that and support that. They wanted to partner up with us, again, to get a bit more traction, to get out more to more clubs, to get more kids exposed to the Meulensteen Method, which would be fantastic. So we're working very hard in the background to find the right means and tools to do that.
René, thank you very much. Thanks for your time. I really appreciate it. It's been fantastic.
No problem. You're welcome.